welcome to this interview with Jonathan Fox and Joe Salas, founders of Playback Theatre. This is one of a series of interviews focused on the beginnings of Playback Theatre in Australia and New Zealand. I'm Michael Pooley, and this is the full interview with Joe and Jonathan, whose willingness to say yes to an invitation to visit Australia and New Zealand in 1980 saw the birth of playback in this part of the world. During reflections on 40 years of playback at the Montreal IPTN conference in 2015, Jonathan, Joe and Judy Swallow talked briefly about the role that Australia and New Zealand played in the spread of playback. I realised that I didn't know much about that history, and that was one of a number of prompts that led to this project. Joe and Jonathan kindly gave me time on the 6th of December 2019 during their very busy schedule at the IPTN conference in Bangalore. For those who have listened to any of the other interviews, you will know that there's always background noise to deal with. Unfortunately, this is very much the case in this interview. There's constant banging going on in the next room, noise coming in from outside, and as well as that, Joe had some chest congestion she was dealing with. Through all of that though, the excitement they felt in that trip is obvious still, and their reflections on their interactions with practitioners in this part of the world are found to be really enlightening. I hope you enjoy this interview. So Jonathan and Joe, thank you for your time. And as we've been talking a little, it's an opportunity just to hear some recollections of that trip 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
And I'm interested with, of your recollections of the seed for the trip. Your connection with New Zealand is obvious.
Well, actually, that wasn't the seed for the trip. It happened quite independently of my connection to New Zealand. So you can say how it happened.
Well, so there are two key elements to this. One is that someone from Melbourne who was not involved in playback, Phil Boaz from PIT, saw us perform in New York City, and being the kind of person he was, he immediately said, I want to bring you to Australia. And he managed to pull it off, which was for us a huge thrill. At the same time, Bridget and Francis, from the time that they were in New Zealand, one of their good friends happened to have our first brochure, a little brochure that said Playback Theatre, and showed it to them. And they kind of saw improvisation, and they saw, I don't know if psychodrama was mentioned, but they clicked with that. And so somehow, as Phil Boaz tried to organize the trip, and they knew they wanted to somehow connect with us, that first visit, with Mary in Melbourne and then with Drama Action Centre in Sydney was arranged.
So, because I spoke to Phil as well, I forgot to mention that, and he spoke of that trip, he spoke of seeing you and the company perform. Mm-hmm. So that initial psychodrama link was the kind of core link for that trip?
Well, yes, but actually by the time we showed up in Sydney, Drama Action with their Lecoq groups, as well as an interest in applied theatre in the community.
Yes.
That was actually more central than psychodrama. Psychodrama was an important influence. And just as for Francis and Bridget, they went to Perth, but that wasn't their, it became more for Francis later with sociodrama and so forth, but it's never been our main interest.
And it wasn't, when I think of that whole trip, it was, the psychodrama world was not front and center by any means. It was, so we did make that initial connection at a psychodrama conference, but it wasn't the psychodrama community that we were, as far as in my recollection, that we were connecting with. It was this, wild bunch of creative Aussies and Kiwis, and who were most, if connected most of all, through Drama Action Centre.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with Joe on that trip. The number of people from psychodrama who participated with us was relatively few.
So the trip, Phil kind of made the trip happen in a sense.
Yes, he did.
He was the kind of engine. I remember him saying, in this very forthright Aussie way, what would it take to bring 6 of you to Australia? Very point blank. And so and we worked out the cost, and ended up being 4 of us that came.
Yeah.
But he was, I think, a very good organizer, and he linked up with Bridget and Francis and I don't know, they made these connections in the different, those 4 cities. So I think he was putting things together, and he was certainly around, he was part of it once we were there, but I think his main role was kind of behind the scenes, just making it happen.
Right.
And in retrospect, that was a very major task that he pulled off, and led to much more than any of us expected.
So you stopped in New Zealand first?
Yes, we did.
Doesn't matter.
But because then, of course, it became also a family trip. So we travelled with our colleagues, Michael and Judy, and our kids. I think we went first to Wellington, where my parents were, and we actually left the kids with my parents when we went to Australia and New Zealand. Yeah.
And so how did you make a connection then to do, because you did workshops in Wellington?
Well, we came back after Australia. I think Bev was in Australia. No, she wasn't.
No, she was in Wellington.
She was in Wellington, but I don't think we met her until, so we came to New Zealand, visited family, left the kids there, went to Australia, went first of all to Melbourne, then Sydney, then we came back to Wellington, got the kids, and then we did the similar series of things in Wellington, a workshop, and then performance, and then Auckland, same thing. So it was those, Melbourne, Sydney, Wellington,
and
Auckland.
we did 19 days of work in something like 20 days. We were very exhausted, but we were so thrilled at the success of the whole trip that once we got home, it took me days and days and days to be able to fall asleep. It's just the excitement of it.
Bridget and Peter talked about just the thrill of those workshops. I don't know whether you have a memory of what it was like, because, so at this stage, Playback was 5 years old.
Yeah.
Had you been doing many workshops to train others, or was it still in the phase of learning?
We've begun to do some teaching.
Not so much.
But, looking back, now we think of a company that's 5 years old as being in its very early stages, so it's kind of outrageous. So we had some idea of how to transmit it, and it worked, obviously. Yeah, we shared very openly everything that we knew, and they were meeting us more than halfway. They were coming with performance skills and tremendous enthusiasm and openness, and many people had backgrounds of one kind or another that were relevant. And it is a long time ago, but my memory is in all of those workshops, it was just kind of a ferment of creativity and encounter and co-creativity.
And I remember, I thought of myself as a theater person, even though I didn't have formal training in theater.
Just let it go past.
So it was very meaningful to me that we would find ourselves at something called the Drama Action Center with people who were doing intensive theater training. And so I love that.
Yes. And Peter's memory is that it brought together all those things that they were working on at Drama Action. And he was a kind of a distillation of that. In both Melbourne and Sydney, and I'm not sure about New Zealand, but there was certainly a performance in Sydney.
Yes.
Well, there were two. One was at the Nimrod Theatre.
Yes.
And they had a very strange set, so it was after the regular show. It started at 10:30 at night or something.
A Greek play, Greek tragedy or something.
And we adapted to this set, but the place filled up.
Yes.
And so that was a big thrill. And then there was such interest that we did a second show at the Greenwich Community Center.
Okay.
Right.
And in that show, Francis and a group of students did a little commedia interlude. And as you probably know, we did workshops in each place, and we selected some of the workshop participants to act with us. So if you look at a photo, there are about 8 people on stage, 4 of us, but 2 actors of us, and we had 4 actors When we started, we had many more actors than we do now because we were nervous. You see Bridget and Francis and I forget who else up there, and that model, they didn't have the skills that we had, but they knew the people.
Right.
And they knew the culture.
Yes.
And
really
this model really was a seed for much that happened later.
Yes.
And I think that was another reason, of course, that it added, it kind of upped the ante of the workshops, because we all knew that this would culminate in a performance in Melbourne. I think it was three that we did. We did one in Wellington. I'm sure we did one in Auckland. I can't remember right now.
Yeah.
And two in Sydney. And so, we know this is coming up. They know it's coming up. There's this very awkward business of choosing some people to join us.
Yes.
Somehow that worked. That was all right. But I also remember, the kind of all the behind the scenes stuff, including in those days, we, the New York company, and we were just called Playback Theatre because when we started, of course, there were no others. So we'll say the original company. We didn't call ourselves the original company. We were just Playback Theatre. But our performing outfits were kind of cotton pants and plain knit tops of different colours.
Not t-shirts.
Not t-shirt, long sleeves. And I would never in a million years do this now, but I took on making pants for all of our guest performers. So did I really do this? I did this.
You did this.
I did this. So, I sewed in amongst the workshop and getting ready for it. I made pants for all of our guest performers so that we all were wearing the same outfit. I borrowed someone's sewing machine.
Joe knew how to do this.
That's because I'm a Kiwi, That's one of the things that, and I think there's probably an Australian spirit as well. You basically, you do whatever needs to be done,
Yes.
So
Yes.
I knew how to make pants, and I made pants.
So,
And I remember Judy, our dear Judy, American who faced with an iron and an ironing board, just like, what do you do? I don't know, I don't iron things.
recollections of those performances were pretty intense and exciting.
Yes.
And somewhat rough and ready as well.
Yeah.
But they worked.
They worked. Well, the audience liked it, so we were happy. I remember one story from the Nimrod performance, and it was someone saying, we had a kookaburra on the roof and it was really noisy. And that was the story. And later I thought, this audience is too big. I mean, people are just telling anecdotes. But later, as I learned more about they use stories as an expression of identity, really. A kookaburra on the roof is not necessarily a superficial story in Australia. And so my lesson was I didn't really listen deeply enough.
There's also, there was more than one story like that, encounters with nature.
Sure.
And we've learned to recognize that these actually are very primal human stories about encounters with the natural world. We now know when someone offers a story like that, it's not at all slight, that people on a very, very deep level value these encounters.
So I was just interested to explore then in Sydney. Peter's memory was that at some point, he wasn't sure when, there was a walk in the Ku-ring-gai National Park.
That's right.
And his memory is during that is when Bridget and Francis floated the idea of establishing do you have a different memory?
I don't remember that. I do remember the walk and how spectacular and beautiful it was.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that discussion. And I'm not sure, maybe it was, do you?
No.
Yeah. I don't think we were expecting that companies would spring up from these workshops. And I don't have very clear memories of how that happened, but I do remember the feeling in all of them, all four of the workshops, that people were really embracing the work and they were doing it very well. They brought such openness and artistry and also kind of homogeneity. There were not a lot of big cultural gulfs to bridge. It was kind of an obvious next step, like we're not going to stop doing this just because you go home, you know, we're going to continue. So it felt very organic that there would be ongoing, you know, something coming out of this. And we stayed in touch with people, you know, afterwards. And it just makes me think of, you know, in the subsequent years when we would hear about playback in Australia actually growing very fast and the community accepting it and welcoming it in a way that hadn't happened for us in New York. And I remember I wrote about this in the first piece that I wrote about playback that was published. And I think this part of it ended up not being included, but just reflecting on how playback found a readier home in that part of the world than it did in the United States. And my theory is because there was still in Australia and New Zealand enough of an intact sense of community that this kind of theatre made sense. Whereas in the United States, it takes a very long time to convince a community that they need this kind of conversation through theatre. It seemed to just work better in that environment. And so we were sometimes even a little envious of how quickly it developed and how busy people became when we were struggling to get just square one of acceptance where we were.
When playback started, we certainly from the beginning were not interested in controlling it or making money from it, or we had a kind of peer, you know, if you like the song, sing it. I mean, and so we were more excited than anything when people at Sydney wanted to keep going.
We were thrilled.
Yeah.
You know, there was absolutely no sense of, I mean, I don't think it ever occurred to us like, well, this is ours. You know, no, it was the opposite. It was like, wow, how fantastic. You want to keep doing this. It was like we suddenly had this, you know, these cousins and brothers and sisters, and, you know, it was great.
And of course, we liked these people tremendously, so that made a big difference too. You know, we wanted to stay in touch, and that they wanted to keep doing the work. It was great.
And there was a real discovery of kinship, which continues to this day.
And Mary remembers, she talked a little about, because she then came and worked with you in York, and I think lived with you.
For a short time. She came.
And again, she found you very encouraging and, you know.
You know, the Australia-New Zealand spirit would be to be so hospitable. You know, they're not going to put us up in a hotel, and so that did become part of our early ethos. I mean, Joe is a New Zealander, but when we first did training, we tried to put everyone up in houses of friends and things like that. So when Mary came, of course we were going to put her up, and it was also a very big recognition that someone would want to come all that way to learn more. It was so early that it was an honor in a way.
She kind of, I mean, it was a great model because she sort of apprenticed herself, you know.
Yeah.
She was already a person of accomplishment, and she had the commitment and the humility to say, I put myself in your space to learn what you had to teach, and of course she had so much to teach herself.
And that is a testament to Mary's character.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, we, and through us, the development of playback in general has been influenced. The influence has gone the other way as well, you know, that we've been influenced in some ways by how things have developed in Australia and New Zealand, that we've been enriched by that. And then, you know, that is where, you know, my background comes in as well as there are elements from just being a New Zealander which have fed into, from the beginning, into playback, how playback is conceived, which may be an indirect reason why it was so recognizable and embraceable by these playback pioneers in Australia and New Zealand. That we had this sort of informal, in some ways irreverent kind of atmosphere. I'm not sure how to put my finger on it exactly, but it was, you know, and the sense of being very kind of grassroots and grounded, you know, that it was not, there was nothing pretentious or superior about what we were doing and how we were presenting ourselves. And
I have one just scrap of a memory of Peter Hall and that first trip, who was studying at drama action
Yes,
at that time with his long curly hair. And he was such an eager student. I mean, everybody was, but you know, I just remember him and the intensity of his eagerness, which was, again, a kind of recognition, because in those first 5 years, we had just been trying to develop the stage work, and that somebody else would, you know, and trying to succeed with audiences. But here was people, and Peter in this case, who you could tell was really, you know, excited about doing this, and so that was exciting for us.
Yeah. I'm just conscious
Yeah.
of time. Is there anything else from that trip that?
Yeah.
I just flashed on a memory, and this was on one of our days off in Melbourne. We went to Hanging Rock. There was, I don't know, maybe it was because it was 1980, I don't know, it was, there was this a little bit of an aura of magic over the whole experience that I felt anyway. And I remember people were playing this music. This man who played panpipes, very popular at that time,
it was.
but very haunting, and so that's the soundtrack for me of that time. And I remember going to Hanging Rock. So somebody from Melbourne took us there, and the movie had come out not long before that, and we had this very mystical experience climbing Hanging Rock. All of us sort of lay down and went to sleep.
Wondering whether you would get magicked away.
Yeah. And it was, I think, one more thing I'll say just before you talk about 4 years later. For the four of us, the Playback New York people, it was a very, very significant and bonding experience. You know, we were already very closely connected to have this adventure, and each of us had our own, you know, specific adventures there, or our flavor of our own individual experiences. But for the four of us, it was kind of a touchstone, you know, that resonated forever. Just that we shared that experience. It meant a lot.
Yeah.
So I was invited back 4 years later, and there are two very strong moments for me. And one was that I was invited to teach a playback session to the drama action students at that time. And Francis actually we went by his sailboat from Greenwich to... And that was exciting. But then he introduced me to the students and left. You know, now we're going to do a session of playback. So I began by saying, well, Playback Theatre. And then one of the students said, oh, well, we've done that already. And, you know, he was being dismissive, or, you know, sort of typical Australian anti-authoritarian or something. But at the same time, I thought, oh my goodness, yes, they have done this already. And the Sydney company, the newish Sydney company, they had been doing a project in an orphanage, teaching kids, a series of, you know, eight weeks. And when I was there, was the last session. And the adult company came and did a show. So there were maybe two who were doing the teaching over this time, but the whole group came to do a show for the last, and there were guests, there were officials and whatever. And I happened to be there, so they invited me. And the company did the beginning of the show, and then at a certain point, they suddenly sat down, and, you know, a group of the 8-year-olds just went to the stage to show their playback. And it was the look on the face of these kids as they went to the stage. I'm still moved to remember it. You know, I felt I'm not needed anymore.
Right.
I have two more snippets of memory.
Well, it doesn't matter to me.
It's no, it's just as we're talking, these things come back.
Yes.
These are just snippets.
Yeah.
So I think it was in Sydney when we went to do the second show at the Greenwich. It's always so familiar in playback that you're schlepping stuff, right? You're carrying and you're moving furniture and you're sweeping the floor. So they had milk crates, that we used to sit on. And in the very early days of the New York company, we did too. They'd collected milk crates and they were piled up on the back, I think maybe tied with bungee cords or something to the back of someone's car, or maybe they're visible in or on the car. And we found this grumpy note attached to it saying, "These milk crates are stolen from the milk board." And then my other memory that just came to me was that first night in Sydney, and we were staying at Bridget's house, and waking up in the morning, the early morning, I don't know if you ever went to that house, Ronald Avenue?
I didn't, no.
It was right on the edge of a park, and we woke up to the sounds of the most extraordinary birds.
Yes.
The exotic, it was so thrilling, these exotic birds that I had never heard, and loud chorus of them right outside our window.
Yeah.
So we knew we were somewhere different.
It's a wonderful, and still in some places, not maybe as much now, but that bird song in the morning is very Sydney.
Yeah.
So look, thank you. We will have to finish because I know people are wanting out. I know you've got but thank you. It was just a beginning to help people connect back to,
it's a great
some
idea.
of the beginnings because I've certainly found that valuable, particularly, getting a sense of that influence both ways is really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for finding the time in what's been a very hectic, exhausting time. So,
oh my goodness. So you're having a little adventure of yourself.
I am. Yeah. It's been great. I got to meet Mary and reconnecting with Bridget, which is always lovely. So thank you.
That was an interview with Joe Salas and Jonathan Fox. And I want to thank them again for making the time available in the midst of their hectic schedule in Bangalore at the IPTN conference. And to offer my personal thanks for the generosity in being so willing to share Playback Theatre with those they worked with in 1980 and with so many of us ever since. In the words of Peter Hall, it was a gift. You can hear the full interviews with others who were instrumental in the founding of Sydney Playback at their website playbacktheatre.com.au and enter history in the search bar at the bottom of the page. Each of the interviews has more than I was able to include in the edited video version and are worth a listen. Please email me at michael.pooley@iinet.net.au if you have memories, photos or stories to share about Sydney Playback Theatre at any stage of its 40-year history. We'd love to have those for our archive. Thanks for listening.